So for no particular reason, I thought today would be a fun day to talk about some political books. Obviously, all of these books or series have more going on in them than just the politics and the political maneuverings that are going on, but I do think that they are a pretty big element of the book and provide something pretty crucial to the plot or the world or something like that. So obviously, let's go ahead and get probably the big, most obvious fantasy one out of the way. As soon as I started thinking about making this video, the first series that came up in my mind was A Song of Ice and Fire, a Game of Thrones, as most people probably refer to it at this point. And if you don't know, this is a huge epic fantasy series with a lot of political maneuvering. There is plotting, betrayal, deception, all of those fun things that you would like to see in a political setting is prevalent in this book. Now, obviously, like I said, there's a lot more to this book than just the political maneuverings, but I do think that this is one of those series that highlights it the most. And I think most people would agree that when you think of political fantasy, that this is the series that most people go to right away. And this is one of the fantasy series that seems to kind of hit it right off the start with the political maneuvering. One of the earliest chapters in the book is the king coming to the north and requesting Ned to become his hand. And the story really does begin there and continues on. And you can see all of the different political levels. You have all of the backroom dealings you would want. You have people who are trying to play the game. Some are better at it than others. And honestly, obviously, the Game of Thrones, as the first book is called, and the series is, referred to most commonly, is just like a symbol of the game that is being played and the political maneuverings that are going on. So this is obviously a must-have on a list like this. And honestly, I feel like the next book is another one of those books that needs to be on this list. And this is coming from the sci-fi genre. And this is probably, the best-known sci-fi book of all time. Though some people try to claim this as a fantasy, but that is not here or there. And that is Dune. And I think Dune offers a different perspective than Game of Thrones does for a couple of different reasons. One, obviously the setting and everything is completely different. But you have really, in my mind, three distinct factions in this book. You have the Emperor himself, you have the Harkonnens, and then you have the Atreides. And I think it is a very interesting thing that happens in this book. And there's a very famous scene in this book. If you have read it, you know exactly what scene I'm talking about. But the way this book is written gives you a different perspective into what the characters are saying and thinking, and some of the political maneuvering that is happening. And it's a lot more subtle, I think, in this book than a lot of the stuff in Games of Thrones is. There are obviously very subtle things that are happening in A Song of Ice and Fire as well. But to me, Dune is a different kind of experience. I feel like some of the political stuff that is going on, it's easy to miss if you're not really looking for it. And I think that makes it an interesting read, because I don't know if people would think of Dune as an overly political book to start with. I think once you have read it and you actually think about it, you're like, wow, this is obviously extremely political. There's these warring families, these factions that are going against each other and plotting and everything. But I think a lot of people could also read Dune and just see it as the chosen one story that we get from Paul. And so I think that makes Dune an interesting read. And I do think, like I said, that the language that it is written in gives you just a different perspective. It's obviously written in a way that not a lot of books are today, and that perspective I think makes it very unique and a pretty enjoyable experience. Sticking with the sci-fi genre, and this is another one that I don't think people would think of as an extremely political book or series to start with, and that is The Expanse by James S.A. Corey. This isn't one that came to my mind at first, but the more I thought about this series, the more obvious it becomes that this is an extremely political kind of series. You have Earth, you have Mars, you have the Outer Belters, you have other factions that come to be known as the series goes on that I can't get too much into because of spoilers. But at first glance, The Expanse is really an alien first contact series. At least that's what I think of it. But if you really delve deeper into it, again, kind of like Dune, you see how political it is. And while I do think the characters are probably the strongest aspect of this book, the political maneuvering puts those characters in interesting situations and make them confront things that I don't think a lot of other series do. And I will also say that this is an extremely long burn political maneuvering series. There are things that take the entire series to really come to fruition and see the ramifications for a lot of them. And ramifications are a big part of The Expanse. There are some monumental things that certain political parties do in this series that have wide and drastic changes and harmful impacts for all of humanity. And I think The Expanse provides what I think is probably a more realistic interpretation of what could happen if humanity was able to colonize Mars and then, continue and colonize like outer planets and all of the things that go on. I think The Expanse does a really good job of taking a very realistic approach to what could happen and some of the actual problems that could happen between the different factions. I think it's very easy to see what some of the problems between Mars and Earth could be, and especially the way that the societies on those different planets is set up. The Expanse, really ends up providing an interesting political landscape for you to enjoy, along with the First Contact and the characters and everything else that goes on in the series. The next series is marketed now as kind of a YA novel, but I think the YA novel is really just because one of the main characters is a younger female protagonist, and I think that pretty much any adult could read this and get a lot out of it. And I'm talking about the Aurelian Cycle by Rosaria Monda. This is probably my second favorite fantasy series of all time, which is a crazy thing to think because, like I said, the marketing would not point me towards this book whatsoever. One of the main protagonists is not something that I would normally be attached to, but this is such a well-written story with amazing characters, great political intrigue, and it deserves a spot on this list. The backdrop of the political stuff that is happening in the Aurelian Cycle is we kind of have an Anastasia-like character where he is a member of the ruling class at the time, and that class or that group of people is overthrown and all killed. And he is somehow able to survive and work his way up into the ranks to basically being a general of the military force. But throughout it, we get to learn about his family. We get to see the bad things that his family did, and maybe it wasn't the worst thing that they were overthrown. You have to remember that in this situation, most of the people are extremely happy that that ruling class has been overthrown. So you really get to see him balance his interpretation of what his family was like, those kind moments he had. Obviously, he had loving family, but then you also get to see people talk about how bad and cruel they were and the things that they did and killing innocent people and all of these things. And then you have the new ruler who is in place and trying to spread what he thinks is the correct political way of doing things, and you just get all of this balance and interpretation of what is best for the people, what is best for the individual and the people as a whole. And I think it's just a really well done political story that is taken all the way through the trilogy. It is only a trilogy, so it's not like an overly huge commitment, but it is one of the best. And like I said, it is written in a way that is marketed for a YA audience, so it's not something that is going to be the most obscure way of telling you a story, but that I think it still asks a lot of important questions and it gives you some interesting answers and options for answers. It's not telling you that necessarily one way is better than another. And I think that is something that's important in a book that kind of has a heavy political tilt in it, is that it gives you options to see a lot of different things. And I think the Aurelian Cycle does a great job with that. The next series is currently a booktube darling, and I'm talking about The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janie Wertz. Now, I am only 3 books into this series, but this series has a lot to offer in much of a Game of Thrones sense that the political aspect is extremely important to the story. There's obviously a lot more going on, and I will always say anytime I talk about Janie Wertz, her writing is absolutely on another level compared to most people. Now, the big thing here is you have city folk and clan folk, and there are all kind of conflicts in between those two groups, and our story follows 2 brothers, and each one of them kind of becomes part of one of those classes. And so you get to see all of the maneuvering and battles and just everything between those 2 brothers. And I think it is, once again, this is a series that plays with the who is right and who is wrong. And I do think that it's a little bit easier to pick one side than the other, especially where I am at in the series. But I do think that there are plenty of heartbreaking moments that help justify either character's response to what is happening. There are some truly heartbreaking scenes in the 3 books that I have read so far, and the political aspect that has been used to set up those moments has been fantastic. And I'm super curious to see what other factions really come into play. So I mentioned you have those 2 groups of the town folks and the clan board, but you also have a group of wizards and you also have a group of witches, and they're all just trying to kind of play this political game and turn the screws the way that they want them to be turned. And I think that really just makes this series to be in the conversation of like a Game of Thrones, because it is just one of those ones that, while the political aspect of it is really important, there's a lot more going on. This next series is a lot of people's first foray back into adult fantasy, and it's probably not one that they think of as a political book all that much, because the way this book is marketed is much more of an action heist kind of story. But if you really think about it, there are huge political elements into Mistborn. And I'm actually going to include Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2 in here, though when I think about it, I do think more about Era 1. And it's really, if you think about it, it is the oppressed going against the oppressors. And I think there are a lot of interesting questions about the right way to handle some things. How should noble people be handled? How should the upper crest of society in a world where the lower level of society is trying to rise up against that. How should some of those people be treated? There's very much a should you eat the rich kind of situation going on here with some of the characters, and there are drastic people on every side of that, and I think that makes it a pretty interesting thing to add into an already great magical world. Most people talk about this series and they talk about how great the magic system and all of those kinds of things are, and there's epic moments, and all of that is true, but I do think there is some very interesting political commentary going on in the Mistborn series. Mistborn Era 2 follows that same kind of pattern, but because of the timeline that Mistborn Era 2 is set in, the question is asked slightly differently, and I think there are some pretty interesting things, especially corruption is a much more influential part of Era 2 than Era 1, just because of the setting of both of those eras of Mistborn, and so I think both of them are a very interesting thing. And I just to make a slight prediction, I think Era 3 is going to be even more political heavy. I just think it's going to encompass more of the Cosmere than just the Scadrial itself. I think we're going to see some far-reaching tendrils in, I believe it's going to be called Ghostbloods, Mistborn Era 3. So that is just a quick prediction for me as far as Mistborn goes. Next up is another series that I have only read one book. It is a trilogy, but I do think it belongs on this list, and that is the Five Warrior Angels trilogy by Brian Lee Durfee. And for me, I'm really just talking about The Forgetting Moon because that is the only one I have read so far. This is a world where there is really two religious factions. So you could think of those as the political parties in this, and they are on the verge of a holy war. And holy wars, you probably don't necessarily think that that is a political matter, but if you really think about it, religion is extremely political, and the differences that both of these sides have are extreme. There are fundamental differences that they have, that they believe in, and you are kind of seeing the ramifications of that, and how, because one side thinks differently than the other, they are, going to come and conquer. And there are definitely some religious prophecy things that are going on here that are kind of helping absolution along. And I really think that the Five Warrior Angels, and I'm hoping that this continues as the story goes on, but there are definitely some like big political moments in here that are happening. And even inside of each faction, there are political things that are happening that are quite interesting. Betrayals, framing, blackmail, all of those kinds of things I think are important in a political story, and those elements are prevalent in the Five Warrior Angels, along with this just being like a kick-ass book. This is a grimdark world, so if you're not in for that, I mean, if you like Game of Thrones, I think this is a fine one to come into and read. But once again, a great setting and great magic, great world building. Everything is fantastic here in the Five Warrior Angels. And the last series I wanted to talk about here is my favorite series of all time, and that is the Three-Body Problem. And this is a unique political series because of a couple different things. One, this is a series that spans an incredible amount of time. So you see many different political combinations of how people feel about things throughout a extremely long period of time. And I think that is one of the things that I enjoy about it the most, is you will have a character, you will think one thing, and you'll think characters will feel one specific way. We will have a transition in time, and things have drastically changed. There are whole sections of this book where we go through eras of time where people feel certain ways about the situation that is happening. And I'm being vague, obviously not to spoil this series, but I think it is an extremely interesting way to look at how humanity as a whole would act under a first contact situation where there's a lot of time between events. And I think that's an important thing and a difference here in the Three-Body Problem. And there are so many different elements in here that if you like a good political story, I think you absolutely have to read the Three-Body Problem. And before we end, there are 3 books that I just wanted to very quickly mention, because I'm sure there are people scratching their head on how I have not mentioned 1984, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451. Those are obvious ones that are very political heavy, but I don't know, I just didn't feel like including them exactly on this list, but I felt like they had to be mentioned because the comments would just be full of how did you not mention one of those 3 books. But do let me know some political books that I have missed down below in the comments. That's all for me, and as always, have a good one.